Now that's art. Howdy. What does it mean to become competent with one's design? It's interesting to think about when game design starts to outreach itself and become a little too much. Currently, in the year 2024, we're going through quite a crisis in the game industry where it's kind of implied to be imploding on itself. Massive layoffs at big companies, artists being rushed out of the door and replaced with AI that lack the human touch. And at the end of the day, it's starting to become more and more of a technological arms race to pump out productivity for less paid artistic endeavors. And what happens here is that, you know, the game's arms race is really becoming a focus on, oh, does this character have more wrinkles on this console than the other? We gotta beat our competitor. Because it's interesting that while the stockholders might be fascinated by technological marvels, even as of modern day, some of the best games are really pushing the artistic endeavor of less is more. I've been playing Baldur's Gate 3 for over a year now, thanks to my brother buying me the game, and while it does have a high amount of detail, which is not a bad thing in terms of how much voice lines are put in, the music's great, the sound design's great, and it's definitely a game of this era in terms of technological marvels. At its core, it is definitely a less is more type game. Because it actually kind of blows me away that I'm playing this game, I'm having fun, and I realize that this is an old school turn-based RPG. Something you don't see a lot nowadays, especially for AAA. And, you know, sometimes turn-based RPGs were a product of their time because of limitations of hardware. I mean, we're talking early DOS games, Final Fantasy on the NES. Not that Final Fantasy would have been action RPG. We'd have to ask the designers. I think obviously Final Fantasy 1 would be a turn-based RPG even if it was released in the future. Just because of how much it's adapted to, well, very similar to those DOS RPGs, right? And so Baldur's Gate 3 has a very similar element here to where it is a turn-based RPG. You have all this technology available for your consoles and your personal computer, and you really take a step back. You're like, oh, each character's taking turns, which isn't like high demand for your console, but I'm having fun. Not just having fun from the turn-based aspect, but they're reminding you on why that genre is so, well loved. It's extremely chess-like, as Gale would say in the game. It's the importance of each move makes such a big difference. The positioning of your characters and how you can combine different strategies from your characters and their strengths to cover each other's weaknesses to conquer a battle. And a big thing about Baldur's Gate 3's core design is that you are the pilot of these strategies. It's not really holding your hand at all. It's basically the open sandbox of, here are our physics, here are the moves, go crazy. And if you can find ways to just destroy all the demons with one big oil fire, congrats. The game's not going to punish you for it. But that's a very less is more artistic design, is that it's simplified, like here's the oil, here's the fire, we made them interact, but it's up to you to use like creative ingenuity to push that. And I think I'm glad Baldur's Gate 3 has happened recently, because I think it's a grim reminder to some big game designers that might have lost their artistic touch. They're so caught up in the arms race for, again, looking better, sounding better technologically, but it's not. It starts to lose that artistic drive. The core of what can make for like stellar game design. as I have shown with this binder, like early on, this is my Pokemon TCG binder that I, ever since I was young, I kept for, a lot of these like rare holo cards, right? A lot of them are from the Gen 4 2010 era. This one, I remember this one got signed by Jay Witz. He hates, or he used to just talk about Supreme Victor's Arcanine. He was not a fan of this card. I do like the card. But what's interesting is that card was actually specifically made from the card game designers thinking that, oh, little kids are going to play this, so we're going to make a really simple card here, and then they made an English version of it. And that brings me to, what it comes down to about underestimating your player base. So Baldur's Gate 3 is saying, hey, we have all these different options you could do, go crazy. Pokemon TCG in Gen 4 did a very similar thing. They aligned their design philosophy with all these Pokemon have all these options, and you can find a way to win the game in different ways. You can play different play styles, whether you're milling out the opponent, whether you're playing a sturdy tank style deck, or you're spreading a bunch of damage. You're controlling the opponent by hindering their abilities. You're doing straightforward damage. But even the straightforward damage often had to find ways to cover, their weaknesses or find ways to achieve that damage. For example, in 2010, there was a card, Gyarados, that did 30 damage times the amount of Magikarp in your discard pile. So what was really cool there is that you had to, people would streamline their decks to trying to get Magikarp in the discard, and they'd find all these creative ways to juggle Magikarp being in there while also recycling Magikarp because Gyarados evolves from Magikarp. So it's not just, play Pokemon, do damage, win. It's play Pokemon, find ways to achieve this damage, work for it, win. And even in cases of other Pokemon that might be more simple to do their damage, like Donphan Prime, he had the drawback of hitting his own benched Pokemon, so there's ways that the opponents could capitalize on that. And so, another reason why this is one of the most cherished eras of Pokemon, it was actually one of the last times that this kind of game design was really shown in the game. There's been countless discussions on it, but starting with Black and White on especially, they were pushing a more simplified, like, kids won't understand this, we got to make the game even more easier to understand dynamic. Dynamic's pretty ironic here, but you can actually see the age suggestion on the booster packs go down. And what you have is they made the game way easier to play, and they basically, you can play these big legendary Pokemon and have easy ways to do damage without really doing all these different achievements for that damage. And so what happens is the less is more design philosophy kind of gets thrown out the window, and you enter the bottleneck, and you don't want to be in the power creep bottleneck. That's where games start to go on their arms race. So the game industry is kind of on its own bottleneck right now. A lot of companies have to impress stock owners, and those stock owners are like, okay, what's good about this system? More, better is more, graphics, right? And so in Pokemon's case, they thought, oh, kids wouldn't understand all these like crazy strategies. From what we're looking at, again, the age of booster packs went down, but again, kids aren't dumb, and so I think that was a big blunder there. In fact, that's actually where Legos kind of thrive as toys, is they push for creative ingenuity, and then they take bold risks. I mean, they were going to go bankrupt. Basically, they said they were going to go bankrupt if it weren't for Bionicle in the 2000s, and that was a really good creative liberty, a good creative risk, and it was a good gateway for a lot of kids and teens to get into Lego. In Pokemon's case, they kind of messed up where they didn't realize that there were already little kids winning their tournaments with these more intricately designed cards and the game overall. And so what happened is Pokemon has placed themselves in a bottleneck. Now, as of right now, Pokemon has gotten better through many formats after this, but they honestly are still stuck. because again, this goes back to the anti less is more design that can undermine things. And so rather than having stockholders, they're worried about sales. Ironically, with Pokemon, you could just put Pikachu on a marshmallow bag and probably be all right. But ever since they started that design philosophy, they dialed up the HP, they dialed up the average amount of damage these Pokemon could do, and they simplified the effects. And so now, ever since Black and White, they are like, okay, we're going to make a new set, and we're going to have to make reasons for people wanting to buy these cards rather than just playing with these current cards, right? So they kept dialing up HP, they kept dialing up the damage to help make sales look more alluring overall. And that's the bottleneck. That's the power creep bottleneck. It's just more and more and more. So all these cards, design-wise, are competing with each other, where it basically comes down to, if you're not doing this much damage for this much energy, you're already losing the arms race. Because, to win the game, you get 6 knockouts. And so the design of Pokemon became, attach energy, do high damage, win. Rather than, like I said, back then, it wasn't just Gyarados doing damage, it was Gyarados discarding cards. And to be fair, there's been Gyarados cards later on that were printed that are very similar to Gyarados from back then. But by then, the power creep bottleneck has been so high that it can be tough for those cards to compete. Because again, the HP and damage just keeps going up for the big selling poster cards like the secret rares. So that is its own problem. For them to do a reset, they'd have to, do a pretty big reset. They'd have to really understand that they had a really good Apex format with 2010 and the game design. Another thing with that is that those Pokemon had 3 option slots. And nowadays, it's really rare to see any Pokemon with 3 option slots. It's kind of a testament also of the simplification of the game, which is ironic because less is more in the case of by doing less damage and having less HP in Pokemon, there's a lot of more creative ways to get a knockout. But now it's more is more is more is more. Again, very parallel with the game industry. So when, what do you do? Well, in the indie game industry, thankfully, they don't often have stockholders breathing down their necks wanting to see like the next technological marvel over and over and over. And so they get to be a bit more creative with their game design, oftentimes aligning with that NES, Super Nintendo era. Games like Shovel Knight and Undertale, World of Goo. Those were and still are amazing games. They were able to, again, be a creative canvas. And you look at these games and, graphically, they don't demand as much as, games right now in 2024. But at the end of the day, less is more. And because they were more about like working with artistic endeavors and working with different limitations, they're able to be astounded as not just some of the best indie games, but just some of the best games in general. And that's also true with music. Right now, you're hearing some Mega Man music, and some of the best music out there. And on the NES, Mega Man only has 4 instruments. And that blows people's minds to this day, because this music is killer. And the fact that there's only 4 instruments that can be played at a time for this is awesome. Because it shows that the composers never gave up. And, they often say limitations can push for creativity. And I think Mega Man is one of the best examples of that. And it definitely shows that in the music side of, the game industry and in general, as technology advances, it's a lot easier to produce music, but is the artistic drive there? And back then, because you had a big limitation, it kind of was its own. It was its own pit of trials. It was its own filter. Who could go past the filter? Who could climb, past the trenches and create good music through those limitations? While nowadays, it's so it's a lot more easy, so it can be a lot more cluttered. with less effort. And I'm not trying to undermine people that I work with modern day digital workstations for music. It's great. But for me, I always try to place some type of limitation upon myself, because that type of mindset where you have a limitation, but you have a drive and ambition, can take you pretty far. And I think that's what a lot of not just the Mega Man composers, but the Mega Man designers themselves did. The NES, an 8-bit system, didn't deter these designers from putting a lot of cool and creative stuff in there. And I think, nowadays, because those limitations are basically gone, obviously there's always going to be some type of console or technological limitation technically, but in terms of freeform agency, it's a lot higher. But ironically, it's higher, but yet more restricted because of, the demands of who writes the paycheck, or, just some petty way to think. It's kind of like a disconnect from the customer base. Gotta make the graphics even more better. Look at those pores. They better be shining, on that character. They better looking crazy. I want every single tooth counted on Kratos' mouth. He opens up, and I want the dentist to make sure that he's got those clean pearly whites. Give him the full diagnosis. He doesn't need a checkup in 6 months. But rather, it should have been. And that's actually the ironic example. In Kratos' case, I think he's doing fine. God of War is still pretty artistically ambitious, but when it comes to less is more, it's gonna be its own risk now. It's gonna be it's pretty tough to convince some stockholders about we should really dial back to certain. In this case, we should not worry about graphics as much and look at what Baldur's Gate 3 did. It is a turn-based RPG, right? And full circle back to Mega Man. Mega Man actually kind of was the trailblazer for indie games, not just from the classic games, X, Zero, ZX, Battle Network, Legends. Like it also they took a huge Capcom did a huge leap of faith in 2008 and released Mega Man 9, which went back to an NES 8-bit aesthetic. I'm talking about, in the midst of 2008, this is, where graphics are really starting to be pushed. There's a lot of good games in 2007, 2008, 2009. And so to have an NES looking game come back and do so well was awesome. I think that helped. Excuse me, it definitely trailblazed a lot of indie devs to go, wow, we could do that and be successful. There is a way that we, less is more. That Mega Man 9 and 10, 2 years later, showed the power of less is more. And so it's the thing I want to say is that my own custom format, Pokemon TCG Highlander, takes that core design element of the Gen 4 Pokemon TCG format, 2010, and it really pushes to take what was there and dial it up to 11, because I think there were so many things that could be pushed, not just from all the Pokemon designed to be strong and based off of their historical iterations overall, but it's again, it aligns with Baldur's Gate 3. It aligns with that less is more foundation, and in this case, again, all these Pokemon are doing less damage, have less HP on average compared to what's been going on the past few years in Standard. Again, not to undermine Standard, there's obviously there's a lot of hard work that's put into those formats from those competitors in general, but it's it's almost like, because I felt like Pokemon wasn't convinced what they had there was just a gold mine, I wanted to do it, and that's my ambition. And I guess it is pretty similar to some of those indie devs. And it's going to be interesting to see how many more people in the higher ups can be convinced that at times people just want an F-Zero game. You don't have to do these crazy things and innovations. This is one of the best games ever made. and you really don't have to change it at all. You could re-release it in HD and it's good. Less is more. 2003, one of the best games ever made. Ambitious, artistic, and at the time, this actually was. I mean, this was so big graphically and game design wise, it blew people's minds to the point that it still looks amazing to this day. But that's also because of the artistic drive in it. So it really is less is more, and at the core of it all, it's about having that artistic drive, respecting your audience overall, and understanding that sense of discovery and wonder in your players, whether you're Legos or you're a futuristic racing game, I think is the core foundation for a good product. I love Mondays.